My name is Esther Sokolov Fine, and I teach in the Faculty of Education at York University in Toronto, Ontario. And I've been teaching in the pre-service and in the graduate program there since the early 1990s. And my pre-service teaching is at the Regent Park site, where I work with pre-service teachers who are doing their placements in host schools that are in a public housing community of Regent Park. And years before that, I taught at a couple of the schools in that community. I was an elementary teacher, and after that I taught at a small downtown alternative school called Downtown Alternative School, DAS, where I've been doing research for many, many years. Research not at the school, but the research began at the school and then continued for a period of 22 years with the same people who were at the school when I began the research. So I've watched children grow up, and most of that has been done on film. I've always been interested in alternative since I became a teacher, and since sort of early in the days when I was becoming a teacher, very interested in thinking about alternative ways of approaching all kinds of aspects of education, because I think we need to make our classroom environments appropriate for the children who are there. So that means alternatives are inevitable. You have to be able to adapt to reach the children who are with you in the room, and you have to allow the children to have a say in what's going on. So that's what alternative education is, and it doesn't have to be happening in an alternative school to be alternative. But I did come to alternative schools late in my career. I was doing alternative kinds of things the whole time. I've never questioned the word. I think that's a very interesting thing to ask. I think what we are calling alternative schools, what we are calling alternative education, really should be it should be available. It should be education. Education should include the opportunities for all kinds of alternatives. I think we use the word alternative because there was a movement among people who wanted to create opportunities for children that they didn't think were present in regular mainstream schooling. So for some, in some settings and under some conditions, that meant children who weren't succeeding in school. For some, it meant particular teachers or particular groups of parents, or in some cases, particular groups of children who wanted a school that was more democratic, a school that was more focused on a particular philosophy, a school that was more focused on a particular theme, global education, music, art. So I think alternative schools have many, many different definitions, and that's what it means to be an alternative school. You kind of work on your own definition. You work on your own project. You make your school together, rather than having it handed to you from a big government-run institution. But within those big government-run institutions, there is space for teachers to do all kinds of creative, to invent creative ways of teaching, and for children to interact with and make suggestions to their teachers, to their administrators. But I think the opportunities for that in regular mainstream public education have decreased. In the public system, it started in the very late 1960s in the greater Toronto area. Really, the very first one was in in North York. It was at that time the borough of North York, and it was called MAGU, M-A-G-U, Multi-Age Grouping Unit, and it later became Avondale Public School. It started, I think, in the late 1960s, and I think it was started by a group of parents, and I think those parents were, some of them, maybe not all of them, but I think they were York University faculty who were looking for an interesting way and a progressive way of providing schooling for their own children. And I don't really know the full history of it, but there were people who could talk to you about it. But I'm assuming, went to the North York, we don't have a North York Board of Education anymore, but they went to the then North York Board of Education with a proposal. And it was funded probably the same way as all public schools are funded. Certainly now, all the alternative schools are funded in the same way, the same pupil-teacher ratio, the same curriculum mandates, the same goals, really, for children. But I hate this word delivery, but the delivery is different. So the environment is designed by the people who are there, given the constraints of the space, the time of the day, and the curriculum that's mandated. And of course, curriculum mandates change. The government, Ministry of Education, revises its curriculum every so many years, so the mandates change. I started teaching in the middle 1970s, and we had a tremendous amount of freedom as teachers. We were supported in many, many ways by the Board of Education to be inventive, to be creative. We could make proposals for writing projects, proposals for hiring artists to work in schools, proposals for starting children's newspapers. We did all those things. And the Board of Education supported us. I taught for the Toronto Board of Education, and people were brought in from other countries to give us workshops on very progressive ways of doing language education. What was then very popular was process writing, where you were instead of encouraging children to prepare for tests and perform so that the school was up to a particular standard that was set externally, children were encouraged to do draft writing and have seminars with each other from a very early age, from grade 1. To do draft writing, to choose their own topics, to choose the books they would read, to seminar with each other and give each other feedback and collaborate in a lot of different ways. So there was a lot of collaboration among teachers, collaboration between teachers and children, collaboration among children, and that has become harder and harder for teachers to enact because of the standardized testing that came in the 1990s, the later 1990s. And the other constraint is that our 5 large school boards were amalgamated in the late 1990s, and so there is less local control in the boards, and when there's less local control board-wide, then there's less local control within the school, there's less local control within the classroom, there's less local control within the individual relationships inside that classroom. With the testing and with the cutbacks that came along with the amalgamation, the opportunities for enacting creative and alternative ways of doing things, inventing things, and and getting support for them and carrying out projects. It just became less and less, harder and harder. Reporting to parents in the schools where I taught, for the most part, not every school where I taught, but for the most part, was parent interviews. You would write something anecdotal about the child. The parents would come, the parents, the family would come. The child would often be there. If the family was a family that didn't speak English fluently, there would be an interpreter there, and you'd have a discussion, and the child would demonstrate, this is how we do math, this is my writing folder, this is a book that I just finished writing, this is my autobiography, which painting do you think is mine? Come and see my science project. So the child was involved, and that was reporting to parents, and the report card was anecdotal. And I did a lot of team teaching in my career, so when I was writing these kinds of reports, I would do it collaboratively with another teacher, and we would discuss the child, and we would make the report true to what we understood about the child. And then often the child would be there for the discussion, and you're not evaluating the child, you're seeing the child, talking about the child, talking with the child. The child reads for the parents, and the parents see the classroom, see the dynamics, see other little clusters of children and parents sitting in little sort of project centers in the classroom, and so they get a sense of how the classroom feels during the day, except that on the parent evening, the parents are there too. But that's what the classroom feels like, and the children are demonstrating activity. So the children are kind of the teachers on those nights, and they teach their parents what they do. So standardized testing came in the late 1990s, and along with it, standardized report cards, where it's good really to review this, I think, and to look back at what we now think of as sort of very radical things, but what we did, and these were many of the mainstream schools, very large classrooms, where the first classroom I taught in was a multi-age grouping classroom. It was kindergarten, it was junior kindergarten through grade 2. It was a very large room. It was called an open area classroom. It was Kensington Community School. It was my first school. And I was hired by the board, and then I was hired by the principal to teach in that school. But I was chosen to be in that classroom, or invited to teach in that classroom, by the teachers who taught there. They interviewed people who were going to be teaching in the school, and they invited me, and I accepted. So I was team teaching with people in an appropriate kind of relationship, people who wanted to work together, felt they could work together. And it was a grade spread, so it was called family grouping. So it meant that if a child is in grade 2 and can't read very well yet, which is not an abnormal thing at all, you can have that child in projects with children who are younger, children who are strong readers, and that child maybe is a strong artist, and they can write a book together, and there isn't this feeling of competition, of having to measure up, of being the weakest one in the classroom because you're coming to reading late. Many children who come to reading late end up being, very proficient readers when they're in graduate school. It's not a predictor. The age at which a child learns to read is not a predictor of what kind of reader they will be when they're an adult, necessarily. Sometimes but most of the time, I would say, in my experience, I would say not. You can have very sophisticated children who are having very sophisticated ideas, who are articulating very complex thoughts, and just aren't reading yet. They've been doing other things. They've been thinking about science, or they've been drawing and painting and observing other kinds of things, and the reading comes later. Now that's seen as serious, requiring intervention. Sometimes the interventions make the problems worse. Sometimes the interventions are necessary, but it's very hard to tell at an early age whether it's a delay, a very normal kind of just developmental path that child is on, or whether it's an indicator that there's going to be some kind of problem. So to decide very early on that it's a problem can make it a problem. So in the early days of my teaching career, we didn't see those kinds of issues as problems. We saw reading as a developmental part of a child's life, and we saw writing as a developmental part of a child's life. Some children write long stories before they can read long books. Some children read long books and come to writing less naturally a little bit later. And so there are ways to encourage children, ways to support children without measuring them and measuring everything they do and making them feel measured and judged all day, all year, all the time. I call standardized testing institutionalized child abuse. When I was a young teacher, these kinds of tests didn't exist here. And what we are now calling alternative education was really available everywhere. It really had to do with the teacher, the principal, how much the principal allowed the teacher to be innovative. I was in schools where I was allowed to be very innovative. I chose my schools carefully. It was a heyday of education here. We had everything. So we had everything, and we always wanted more. We always wanted more democratic practice in schools. We always wanted more funding. We always wanted more say in what went on. But I look back and I think what we had here in the 70s and the 80s in Toronto and the early 90s was really optimal conditions for public education. I look back and of course you should never be satisfied. Of course you should always advocate for children and want more for education. But I look back and I think, it was paradise here for children, for teachers, for educators at all levels. And the funding for education was outstanding. We had social workers and nurses and interpreters and all kinds of social services available in all of our schools. And when they amalgamated the schools, they eliminated a lot of positions. So instead of having many social workers, you had fewer. Instead of having interpreters in every board, you had interpreters, you had one big board, so you had fewer interpreters. Instead of having 5 directors of education who really knew their constituency, they knew their schools, they knew the teacher, they knew everybody. They were small, and they knew what went on in every single school. So you had a director of education for 5 different boards. Then you had one director for all of the schools that continued to be active, but it took the power away from the local community. It took the power away from the teachers. It took the power away from the administrators. and it centralized the power. Why I think that testing perpetuates generation after generation. I think we had done away with it here. And I think it came back when the power centralized, when the power when it became much more of a top-down power structure. And it's to prove success because you can't demonstrate it, because you don't know the people you're dealing with. So when you're in a small school, or in a small family of schools, we used to be families of schools, and you'd have an administrator who was in charge of that family, maybe of 5 schools. You could demonstrate the interesting things and the progress of a child to the parents in a very personalized kind of way. When it's enormous, you can't do that. It's impossible. So the board has to demonstrate to the voting public that it is enabling learning, and the only way to demonstrate that is through statistics, because it's too big to demonstrate in little family groups sitting around on the floor looking at science projects. But when you have a family of schools and you have an administrator in charge of 5 schools, and under that administrator you have 5 principals, I think that is the big question. The why question is the big question. And I don't have the answer, but I have the question in my head all the time. And it's the question I teach in a teacher education program. It's the question I want my students to have in their heads all the time. I think there are many reasons why, and we perpetuate generation after generation things that we know don't work, and we do it because it's what pleases the people who are supervising us. So we do certain things as teachers because we're being watched by our principals. Our principals run schools in a particular way because they're being watched by higher administrators. The higher administrators are doing things in particular ways because they're being watched provincially or by the College of Teachers. So there's a hierarchy that keeps certain kinds of power relations in place and certain kinds of practices in place. And you get kind of a contrapuntal interaction going on between decades, between generations. So you might have a very conservative educational set of practices going on for 25 years, and then you get a reaction. You get a movement for change, and so change means becoming more democratic, whatever that means in a school setting. Schools can't be democratic, but learning some ways of being democratic in your interactions, shared decision making. So you might get 25 years of a more liberal kind of education, and then you have a movement of people who say, wait a minute though, how do we know these children are learning? How are we measuring? We want a demonstration through testing, or we want a demonstration through some kind of measurement scheme. And so you get a movement of parents, a movement sometimes of teachers, movement from the voting public for measurement and proof. And so you'll have 25 years of a more conservative style of education. And it changes back and forth. And this is not new. I mean, this has been true for hundreds of years. So you get a back and forth kind of shift that's part of the pattern of how education happens in a democratic society. So I don't think we can say we're doing the same negative things all the time, every year, generation after generation. I think we can say that we have a pattern of becoming more liberal, more conservative, more liberal, more conservative, more liberal, more conservative, and I don't think that will ever change. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, because we can see that many, many students who might not have been as happy or as successful in what we might call a mainstream school are very successful in an alternative school setting and in their lives afterwards, whatever that might mean. It might mean higher education, it might mean in a business of some kind, it might mean as an artist, it might mean as an inventor, it could, but many people coming out of these schools have interesting and happy and successful, in their own terms, lives. Why aren't we doing this for everybody? It's a good question, and it's an important one. And I think the alternative schools really are kind of laboratories where we can see what's possible. And then from those laboratories, if we're smart, we will learn about practices that could be in place in larger schools, what we might call mainstream schools. But I also think that the smallness of the alternative school, just like I think the smallness of a school board is better. And so you can have a very large school with 1,000 kids, and you can divide it into small schools. You can have a school on the first floor and a school on the second floor and a school on the third floor. And there have been experiments with that, and it works. And when I first taught at the Downtown Alternative School, which is one of the schools where I taught, and the school where I started my peacemaking research, we shared the building. It was shared with another alternative school, but we were a freestanding alternative school building. That's very rare. Most alternative public schools here in Toronto have shared space with a so-called mainstream school. So they might have 5 classrooms on the 3rd floor, and the rest of the school is a mainstream school. Why we don't want to make 5 small schools in that big school instead of 1 small school and then 1 enormous school, I don't know. I mean, maybe it's fear of power sharing. Maybe it's teachers who are not comfortable with the idea of working so collaboratively with parents and children. Maybe it's administrators who, fear is the wrong word, but who are, that's not their style. That's not their comfort zone. Or they don't want to change. They're comfortable with what they're doing. They know a certain way of, I like to say, doing school, and that's what they know, and that's what they feel successful at, and so they perpetuate it. But why we perpetuate practices that we know don't work, I think is a huge political question that I don't really want to get into right now, but it's a very important, it's the biggest question, it's the best question, but it's very big. There are people who do well in alternative schools who do not do well in more regimented, more tightly structured, larger schooling environments, who do extremely well, whose creativity blossoms, whose self-consciousness disappears, and they open up, and by opening up with other people and talking more and having discussions, they find out more about who they are. And when they find out who they are, sometimes they find talents and capabilities within themselves that surprised them, that they didn't know was there, because they were quiet, they were shy, they were intimidated in other environments. So for some, that happiness that you're talking about happens in alternative schools because of the environment. But there's another reason. There are certain people who can find their way to an alternative school, and many people who don't know that they exist, don't know how to find them, don't even know to look for them. So that's something that has to change. And I think the fact that you're making a film, and the fact that we've done some studies now, and the fact that other schools are making films and people are writing books, and we had a big conference and we're doing a book about that's rising out of that conference, is spreading the word. It's making alternative schooling, it's bringing it to the awareness of a wider number of people, a more diverse population in the Toronto area, and people will be able to, people who need it or want it will be able to find it. And as that happens, the demand for it among parents and among kids will go up. And the demand can be met by dividing large schools into smaller schools. So maybe something has to change in the way administration operates. Maybe the board probably can't afford to pay principal salaries to 5 people in one school building. But the administrative structure could shift. So you could still have one principal, but you could have 5 coordinating teachers, and you could have 5 small schools, and they can operate separately, but have, different ways of connecting with each other as well. So you can have collaboration among those 5 schools, but communities that know each other. So it's possible to do it, and I would think possible to do it maybe changing the funding formula without changing the cost of schooling. I don't know. I really don't know a lot about the economics of schooling, but I would think that it could be done. And I think once students and parents begin to see more options, those options are more visible, they can think about, what do I want for my child? The child is older. What do I want for myself? And how will I get there? Can I take the subway? Is it close enough that I can walk, that I can ride my bike? Will my parents drive me? I mean, you have all different kinds of families, all different kinds of circumstances, and we should have all different kinds of schools. And I think that does not mean that we do away with standards. I think doing away with standards is different from doing away with standardization. I think those are different things. And if we are not yet able, as a school system, to distinguish between those two kinds of things, if we think that having standards means we have to standardize, and that standardizing means we demonstrate success or achievement through testing, then we have a lot to learn. So it's not just children who have to learn, not just students who have to learn. It's teachers, it's administrators, it's politicians, and it's the public at large. And so education is very much a community project. Whether we think of it that way or not, really it is. And if we don't want, as a community, to buy into oppressive conditions for children, then we have to be willing to open up the discussion and hear each other's alternative ideas. So alternative can never mean the same thing in every setting. I mean, alternative means recognition of diversity, recognition of difference, recognition of each other's thoughts and ideas. Well, one of the alternatives might be a more traditional kind of education. But that doesn't mean it's not an alternative. It's one of the alternatives. And actually, it is. We're kind of maybe we've moved to a phase maybe where that word can be used a little differently now. What it meant originally was alternative to traditional mainstream schooling. But now, maybe we have more sophisticated understandings of what it could mean for a wider, a broader cross-section of the population. It could mean, well, kind of what I was saying before. It could mean you have a big school that houses 1,000 children in one neighborhood, but it doesn't have to be one top administrator and a traditional style of schooling. It could be broken up into communities within the school, and there are schools that have explored this. There's schools in New York that have explored this, and there are a few schools here that have explored this a little bit, and so you can choose your school. When I first started teaching, you could choose, your parents could choose. I was an elementary teacher. You could choose a school for your child. You did not have to send your child to the in-district school. You had completely free school choice. But not all people have the same degree of mobility. So it was the people who could, number one, find their way into the alternative stream and visit schools and have the time and have the transportation to visit schools and choose carefully where they sent their child. And you have to have time. You have to have the know-how. It's easier if you speak English or French, but we didn't have very many French schools here. We had a few, but you had to know how to find your way through the system. So you had to be politically knowledgeable. You had to be able to speak the language. You had to have either a job that would allow you time off as a parent to go see schools, or be a stay-at-home parent. And you had to have transportation. You had to know all of that. So if you're a new Canadian and you want something innovative and creative and appropriate for your child, you might not know how to find it here. And also, as a new Canadian, you might want as your top priority for the child to learn English and learn the traditional ways of being so-called, Canadian, fitting into mainstream society. So you might not want an alternative school for your child. And then you might change your mind when you learn your way around, see how your child is responding to school. If the child is happy, you're not looking for alternatives. If the child is not happy, or if you're being told that the child is not progressing in the way that the teacher wants or in the way that the system wants, you might be completely shocked by that and want to do something different for your child, or you might be very intimidated by that and just want to make your child better at whatever it is you're being told the child is not succeeding at, because you want to fit in, because you want your child to be Canadian. And so, you get all different kinds of people wanting all different kinds of things, and many, many people who don't know how to make those choices in a country where they're not familiar yet. Well, the placement of teachers, the way teachers are placed in positions has changed and changed again and changed again. And I'm not exactly sure. There's something called transfer procedures, and I don't really know how that is working at the moment. But when I was teaching at the Downtown Alternative School, the procedures were kind of mixed. So you had hiring committees, and the hiring committees had teacher representation, the principal, I think someone from the community, and at least one parent, maybe two parents. You were a hiring committee, and you interviewed people. You didn't hire them. The board hired them, but you were allowed to interview them and choose from among people who already had contracts with the board. You were allowed to request certain teachers. So people would apply to that school. There'd be an opening, and teachers who were already employees of the Board of Education would apply for. They would see the transfer list, and they would apply for positions that they wanted. So teachers who wanted to be in a particular school would see the opening. They'd apply. I guess there was I don't remember. I guess there was a shortlisting process. And then there'd be interviews. And the interview would be conducted by this committee. And I think there were other interviews that happened. I think there was a one-on-one interview with the principal as well. And then a decision would be reached, and the person would be offered the position. And if they were still happy with what they saw at the school and the conversation they had with the committee, and they felt comfortable, they would accept the position. And if they were offered the position and they have felt very uncomfortable, they thought they wanted the job and then they weren't comfortable with the people, they could turn it down and they could apply for something else and accept a different position. But then there was, at that time, always a pool of people who were applying for positions, were on the transfer list, were entitled to transfers, and there were still openings, and matches hadn't been found for everybody, and matches hadn't been found for every school that had an opening. So there were, what was it called? There were something placements, I don't know, administrative placements, that's what they were called, administrative placements. So those people were placed. So sometimes that was done very thoughtfully and very carefully, and sometimes it was just kind of random. And it became more random as the board got bigger, right? It was very hard to place the right principal in the right school, for that principal, to find the right match, because it was on such a large scale. In the same way, it would be very difficult to do administrative placements appropriately, because you didn't really, it was on a big scale. You didn't really know the school where you were. If you were doing the placements, you didn't know 500 schools. You might have been able to know 10 schools and do placements well, but if you were dealing with 500 schools, it might have been, pretty random. So people were not always placed in ways that made them happy as teachers, and not always placed in ways that were good for the students in that particular school. So that happened. Mistakes were made, but people have always had the right to, teachers have always had the right to apply for other positions. So if they weren't happy, they might have one uncomfortable year and then, apply for something else. There are quite a number of fairly new, they're not so new now, but, fairly, in the last 10 years, new-ish alternative schools that have opened in the TDSB, and some of them there is one with a Waldorf focus. They have a philosophy, each one of them, that was kind of their starting point as a community. And I don't know how much say they have in their choice of teachers, but I think they have some. They don't do the hiring, but among contract teachers, I would assume they have some voice. We are absolutely unique, probably in the world, certainly in the English-speaking world. We have a system we have a school system, we have a school board that supports many, many, many alternative schools. And we may think it's not good enough, we may think it's not enough, we may think it's not accessible in the ways that it should be to a very diverse population. All of that may be true, but it's better than anywhere else. More than anywhere else. So we're a model, and we need to publicize what we have, not to be famous, but to share what we know. So just like when I said that alternative school is like a laboratory from which we can learn all kinds of wonderful things about how teachers and children can function together and how teachers can collaborate. We also can learn from other school systems. Other school systems can learn from. There's a tremendous amount that we can share, and we should share. We're a laboratory here. I did a study together with Professor Nina Basia at OISE. It was funded by the Toronto Catholic District School Board, and they were doing this is in 2011. It was completed, I think, in 2011. Catholic School Board, which is in Ontario, public schooling, wanted to do a self-study of their alternative schools. Their alternative schools it's one high school with several campuses. And they were doing a self-study. They wanted to know how they were, what was happening and how well they were doing. And so they did, half of the study was this self-study, and the other half was they commissioned a study, and the two people who did the study for them were Professor Nina Basia and myself. And we did a study of what was going on everywhere else in the GTA in alternative schooling. So I can give you the link. The study is very comprehensive, and it lists all the boards that are in the GTA and all the alternative programs and schools that they offer, and all the statistics and the history and the whole story. So it's all there. I'll give you the link. So that's one way of getting that broader picture. And then there's just a list of all the TDSB ones, and it's in that study. So you can see the Peel region, the York region, all the Catholic School Board, the TDSB. I don't want to forget anybody. So what boards am I forgetting?
Etobicoke. I know that's not
No, because
board.
it's not a board anymore.
Scarborough, no.
Those were all boards of education, and they were all very progressive. Etobicoke, very progressive. Scarborough Board, very progressive. York Board, very progressive. East York Board, very progressive. Toronto Board, very progressive. North York Board, very progressive. Put them all together, amalgamate everything, fire all the directors or put them back in classrooms, directors of education, and choose one, and then put in procedures for standardizing everything, and then monitoring the standardization through testing. You get a completely different way of doing education, except that we have many, 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 many teachers who were there before this happened, and they know what they were able to do as teachers, and they still do it. So we have a lot of wonderful teachers, and the obstacles are many for these brave and wonderful and creative teachers. But brave and wonderful and creative teachers figure out how to do it anyway. And as we educate young people, new people to the profession, we have to share that history. And we have to remind them what they experienced when they were children, whether it was here or in another province or another country, and decide was good for me and what was terrible for me, and what do I want to advocate, and who do I want to be as a teacher, and why? What does that mean? And is everybody else going to be just like me? No. So how do I differentiate between what I think is the best for people like me and what is good for people who are very different from me? What do they need? So it's, very important that as we bring new people into the profession, we talk in these complex ways. We don't oversimplify what it means to teach. Standardization is an oversimplification. It's an extreme simplification of education. That's what it is. That's what it's about. It's not what it's for, but it's what it's about. It's how it happens. Simplify, and then it's easier to take control. My project rises out of my work at the Downtown Alternative School, where I was a teacher in the late 1980s and early 1990s, just before, it was my last public school teaching before I went to teach at York University. Before I went to teach at York University in the Faculty of Ed. And Downtown Alternative School calls itself, well, I think the name has changed now, but it was DAS, so DAS was what the school was called. And they were a small alternative school. Grades started as a kindergarten, long before I was there, as a kindergarten, and then K1, and then K1-2, and it moved up to K through 3. When I was there, it was JK through 3, and wanted to expand but couldn't because there was no more space in the building, and they were sharing the building with Alpha, which is another very wonderful alternative school. So there was no room to expand. But they were exploring a peacemaking program, and I'm writing about that program, and I did a study on film of that program with filmmaker Roberta King and Ron Squire, and we filmed in the school for 3 years, 1993 through 1997. We filmed at the school every 6 weeks for the full school day for 2 years. And then in the third year, we did follow-up interviews. Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada were the funders. And we finished in 1997. Then we took a couple of years, and Roberta and Ron made a documentary film, a feature-length film, called Life at School, the DAS Tapes. And that film launched in 2001 at the Art Gallery of Ontario. And part of the story there is that the whole community came back, everybody. We filled the auditorium at the AGO, and we did 3 screenings in one night because people were lined up around the block trying to get in to see that film. So it was way beyond what you always hope 3 people will show up, right? And it was a hot topic. People wanted to know about peacemaking and how it was happening in schools, and it was being very strongly supported in schools in the 1990s when we started our project. So we filmed, then we made the documentary, and then I got a second grant, also a SHIRK grant, for 3 more years, and we did it 10 years later. So we didn't follow the school. We followed the children and the parents and the teachers who were at the school at the time when we did the original study. And so we interviewed them 10 to 12 years later, and we didn't do a documentary that time. We did a website. So we have films on a website, and I'll give you the link to the website. It's www.childrenaspeacemakers, all one word, .ca. So that's how you get to our website. So you see the children grown up. Grown up then meant in high school or just about ready to start university. Now many of them are coming back, and we're having this third study that I talked about. So that's starting in December, and I have some funding for that. And so they've grown up to be teachers. One of them is a filmmaker who does work in school, so she may do some filming after I'm finished with my third phase. They may want to continue. I'm hoping that they'll have discussion that is helpful for them, and that will carry on in some way. And I'm writing a book about that 22-year project, and it'll come out in the spring probably of 2015. It became very, very popular here. DAS teachers were sent to speak to the Canadian military I think in Germany, I guess in the very early 1990s. We did workshops in other parts of Canada. We won awards that paid for travel. So we were, different teachers from DAS went to different places and gave workshops. We won what's called a Hilroy Fellowship, and the Hilroy Foundation sent DAS teachers to give. Their mandate is to send people who win this award to communities that request workshops, so they pay for the professional development. So there was one in Germany. There were, I think there were some in Alberta that we did. There were some at, in different parts of Ontario. And then when the amalgamation happened, the attention and the support for this program, I don't like to call it don't even use that word. It's not a program. But for that approach, just became almost forgotten. So there were teachers who still did it because they had done the training, they had very interesting results in their own classrooms, and they wanted more. But the workshop stopped, the professional development stopped, the money dried up, the support was gone. The other thing that happened when amalgamation happened is that early retirement packages were offered to many, 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 many people. And many people took them because they could see what was happening and they didn't want to be part of it. So we lost a lot of the memory. You lose memory. When you lose experienced teachers, you lose the memory of what happened, of what was. When I first started teaching at York in the early 1990s, I was teaching about what was considered progressive education in those days. And I was teaching graduate courses, and my approach and what I was trying to convey seemed very radical to my students. And it was about developmental practices, it was about developmental reading, developmental writing. That was being very strongly promoted in the US, in Britain, and here at that time. And it just seemed, it was radical. So people loved this, but they saw it as radical. Over the years that I taught, I reached a point where it was no longer radical. It was mainstream. Everyone knew these things. Everyone knew about developmentally appropriate curriculum. Everybody knew about process writing and developmental reading and differentiated instruction. Everybody knew that. And it wasn't radical anymore. It was mainstream. And so you didn't need to teach that to your students. It was common knowledge, and you could go on from there. And now it's radical again. Like, people don't know the memory of it has disappeared, and so it becomes radical education again. So what is radical and what is mainstream kind of changes position in relation to one another, depending on what has happened in the previous 10 years, right? So what was radical in the early 90s is radical again. And people think it's new. It's so old. And it's so common. I don't want to say common sense, because that was, all the amalgamation. That was it was called the Common Sense Revolution. And it was a very conservative movement. That was the late 1990s in Ontario. It was the Common Sense Revolution. So if you use that word, it has terrible connotations as far as I'm concerned. But it was common knowledge that children learn to read in different ways. Children learn to read through meaning rather than through phonics in English, because phonics doesn't work reliably in English, does in some languages, does in Spanish, I'm told. It doesn't work in English, but it's very strongly promoted by the US government and by all the big educational publishers in Texas and the test makers, because you can test it. Alternative education, to me, means that the participants have a say in what goes on. The teachers, the children, the parents, the administrators, and that education becomes a conversation among the participants. At Downtown Alternative School, DAS, a small school in Toronto, children and adults explored peacemaking to help build a warm and inclusive community where ongoing conflicts and bullying behaviors could be faced and handled safely and fairly. This book presents an alternative approach to public elementary schooling. When I was a child, I did not picture myself as a teacher. I did imagine growing up and having more freedom. I was forever looking for somewhere else to be as I rode my rusty blue tricycle around and around the block, hoping to get lost. In my starchy blue dress, mid-city Detroit, Fitzgerald School, 1940s, I poked under the inkwell, caused a nasty spill, and was moved to a special chair near the teacher's desk. I didn't know how to play on a playground, so mostly I wandered around waiting for recess to be over. Occasionally I ventured partway up the jungle gym, but mostly I studied the people and the action. I had friends, but we tended to walk and chat rather than run and jump. I couldn't hit a softball. Kickball was not much better. Teachers were strict but friendly, demanding yet compassionate, and for their time, they were probably well-informed, progressive, and reasonable. This is the 1940s. The best part of school was when librarian Mrs. Barnes and some of our homeroom teachers read aloud from wonderful books. The worst part was the long walk home from school, crossing the vacant lot by myself on a narrow path that led to Lilac Street. Bullies lurked there, and sometimes stray dogs. I remember my fear. I remember a snaggle-toothed boy named Roland in a black leather jacket with crisscross zippers. He had wild eyes, a cackle laugh, and a knife. I remember treading cautiously and quietly with my eyes on the ground, hoping he wouldn't notice me. Sometimes he did. The schoolyard felt safer. Many years later, as an elementary school teacher, surrounded by playground activity, I was sensitive to kids who seemed uneasy. I was searching for and writing about alternative ways of doing school. With 12 years of teaching under my belt, much of it in public housing communities, I was invited by teachers and parents to join the staff of the downtown alternative school. As fairly mild, everyday conflicts became a center of attention there, I found myself increasingly able to focus my eyes and ears on people, actions, and negotiations. What a journey this has been for me, and for those of us who shared in the wonderfully collaborative years of teaching and research that began at that school. In this book, I look at the DAS Peacemaking project, how it took ordinary, everyday, child-to-child conflicts and viewed them as learning opportunities. While I incorporate material from interviews and transcripts, I relate this as a narrative rather than an academic text. It is my story and many stories. It is a trail of rethinking, negotiating and renegotiating, solving and resolving, and occasionally resolving teaching and learning dilemmas. It is a tale of one school's optimistic effort to create and sustain healthy, safe, equitable, and academically relevant conditions for and with people whose lives were and are at stake in public education. It is about children and adults growing together as they work day by day to discover more about what it means and what it takes to become responsible citizens who care about each other, about their community, and about the world.